Artificial intelligence and robo-advisors. Is it time to turn your wealth over to a computer? Jacob and I sit down to discuss the pros and cons of this new technology. So I think this will be an interesting conversation because I think we have two really different perspectives, right? You've got an old fart like me that is in the finance side, the financial advisor side, and we've got a young buck who was an IT/software major that just switched that I think understands the world of AI a little bit better than I do.
On a surface level, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So, but being how you've worked in the industry with me for 2 years, I think it'll be an interesting conversation. But what's fascinating is a lot of the big wirehouses are starting to push this thing, the robo-advisor, right? Which is kind of interesting because I don't know if that brings comfort to people when they hear that, like there is a robo-advisor. I just think of like RoboCop from the 1980s, and that wasn't necessarily a good thing, but it's a trend that's actually picking up steam, right? Where people are saying, yeah, like robo-advisor, it takes the place of a human being, and it's supposed to be cheaper because you don't have to pay a financial advisor. But to be honest, it kind of scares me to death.
Yeah.
But I think about how AI, and maybe I'll ask you, like, okay, so what is the definition of AI? Because for a long time we've had like software programs or computer programs that will go out and gather data and come back with maybe a conclusion, right? Like you can even program Excel to do something like that, right? But I guess to start off, I mean, what is AI as compared to a software that goes out, gathers information, and gives you a conclusion?
So from my understanding, a lot of what we call AI, artificial intelligence, is machine learning. What that means is software developers will create a database that continues to grow and grow and grow, and then an algorithm that makes conclusions off of that data. So things like ChatGPT, they'll scour the internet, and then this algorithm will make conclusions off of that data that it can find. And that's a super surface level understanding.
Right.
And it gets a lot more intense than that. But I would say that on a surface level, it's a computer algorithm making decisions based off data, a lot of data.
Right. So it's kind of interesting, right? Because at least when I went to school way back when, the idea was that a conclusion is only as good as the data input that you have, right?
Right.
So I suppose if it's scouring the internet and it's bringing back data or information that it can use to bring up an answer, if you will, hopefully it's finding the right information.
Sure. And I guess it's not just, looking at the internet. It creates patterns. It looks for, similarities between certain things. It tries to create conclusions based off what it can see and what it can predict.
Right. So is Google Translate, is that AI?
I think it uses elements of machine learning for sure.
Okay. Because there's certain things that all of us use, right? And you think, oh, like I can just type in this word to Google and it's going to tell me what it is in Spanish or whatever. And I think that that's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Right. But it's also interesting to me because I'm fluent in 2 languages, right? English and Spanish. And sometimes if somebody who speaks Spanish or somebody who's trying to speak English, if they use Google Translate and then they show it to me, it might put you in the ballpark as far as like, okay, I can kind of get what you're saying, but It's not necessarily correct, right? It may not fit maybe the way, because there's different cultures of Spanish too, right? And the way they speak in Puerto Rico versus Spain versus Mexico is very different. And so, I mean, those are some of the things that I look at and I say, that's a really neat feature. But if I was kind of betting my marbles on a software like that, I know that it's not quite nailing, 100%. Right?
Absolutely. And I think AI specifically has so many branches and so many types, and there's different types of machine learning and all of that. So its application really varies from application to application.
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess it depends on the application a lot of the time.
Yeah. And so me being old and whatnot, I think that just using my Google Translate example, right? I'm like, okay, if Google Translate does this thing, right, and it gives me a sentence and it structures it away, and maybe it's like 80%, maybe even 90% there, right? I think my biggest worry is I'm saying, okay, well, that's just literally taking words from one language and translating it into another. Fairly simple to do. If we're talking about something as broad as finance, right, with all the moving parts in there, that just kind of blows my mind that there could be an AI, a robot, whatever you want to call it, that can do better than what Google Translate's doing.
Sure.
And I think that historically, and I get the thing too that, like, okay, AI is evolving, right, and it's learning and it's becoming a bigger thing. But the one thing is there was a bank, and we won't mention names here, but there was a large bank, and it was doing the underwriting of the loans using AI. So the computer would come in and it would look at all the financial data, credit scores, how much money's in the bank, what's their income, what's the property value, all this stuff that normally a human would do, and it would kick out the answer whether somebody was approved or not. And so this very large bank was like, oh, this is the greatest thing ever because now we can run more efficiently. We don't need all these underwriters and we can just do this loans this way. But what was fascinating is because the AI was sourcing historical data, it inadvertently became racist because what it was doing is it would go into certain areas, geographically speaking, that happened to be maybe lower income or that had been suppressed economically for other different reasons. And the computer was looking at data that was older, right? Maybe not as politically correct as we are now or
Sure.
other types of things, right? And because it was using that data, it inadvertently had become racist. And
Yeah.
so, those types of things, I think it's fascinating to look at, but also I think turning 100% of our lives over to robots, again, it's another scenario where it's not exactly perfect. And
It feels Terminator-esque to me.
right,
Invest with me if you want to gain. Like that's
the thing,
yeah. I don't. It doesn't sit right with me.
yeah, yeah. And I think as far as, so there's another thing about robo-advisor that is kind of interesting. Like, what is the definition of an advisor, right? So some people would say an advisor is someone that tells me how to invest my money.
Sure.
Okay, so we're talking about asset allocation at this point. Are we talking about how much stocks versus bonds? Am I going to be an international versus domestic? All these types of things. If somebody asked me what the percentage of my job is asset allocation, I would probably say 15, 20%.
Yeah. And I'm sure that definition varies from individual to individual and relationship to relationship, but
Yeah,
it's still that role specifically is not a huge part of it.
right. And so, you look at that and you say, okay, a computer, there are, if you go back to even modern portfolio theory, which goes way back and all these things. And so a AI could probably say, well, this portfolio, if I design it this way, is on the efficient frontier and we should have a good risk versus return. And it could maybe hypothetically spit out an output, right? For somebody to say, oh, well, you should invest in a 60-40 portfolio,
Right.
or something like that. But there are so many different dynamics that come into it, I think, from a personal standpoint. I think a lot of times when we just focus on just purely asset allocation, if I'm sitting with someone and this has actually happened, right? Like somebody might tell me, okay, I'm a level 5 out of 10 on how aggressive I am, right?
Sure.
And they might fill out a questionnaire to find out how aggressive they are. That's only one element because some of my clients would say, hey, religiously, we really lean one way and we don't want any of our money to be invested in, things that we consider to be immoral.
Sure.
Well, I don't know. Is that part of an AI's question? And is the AI going to be able to go back and say, oh, okay, well, if I need to find maybe funds that don't invest in those types of things, does it have the ability to take that plan and custom curtail it?
And I almost know for sure that as it progresses, if it's not already, that'll be a facet of it, right? You can enter that information in, but I think it goes deeper than that. Beyond asset allocation, what questions is AI not asking that an advisor in the space is? A person, a human, a face on the other end of the table, not a keyboard. What questions are they asking that AI is not?
Right. What's your opinion on that? What questions do you think those might be? I mean, with your experience.
I think because it's an algorithm and because it's a program, I think a lot of the time it focuses on material facts. But the problem is that we are emotional individuals attempting to have a rational experience. And AI, I don't think, has quite grasped that yet. So, especially when it comes to money, most things are emotional.
Right.
Whether, regardless of how straightforward and rational and logical we try to be, I think that emotion always comes into play.
Absolutely.
And I don't think that AI is quite factoring that into it. And that could be a good thing. That could be a horrible thing, just depending on the person.
Right, because there's two elements to it, right? So there are portfolios, and we use portfolios that you could say use AI, or we could say it uses a computer algorithm, and what it does, it goes out into the place. It gathers up over 200 points of data every single day, and it brings it back in, and it comes to a conclusion whether we should be in the market or out of the market, and that makes sense.
Right.
So, and some of those programs have been extremely successful. And what's
Absolutely.
fascinating is when you compare the computer versus humans, and which one has performed better. A lot of times the computer can outperform because the computer doesn't watch the news and get scared about what the
Right.
current political environment is, or there's a natural disaster. It doesn't care about any of that. It just looks at the pure facts and it says, okay, economically speaking, this is what's happening in the economy, and maybe I'm going to pull back or I'm going to go in. But to your point, that's only with the software looking at the portfolio and the investments. That I would say a good portion of my job is helping people manage their own emotions, right?
Right. And expectations.
Yeah, and expectations. So the hard thing is, and we saw this just in COVID in 2020, right? So in 2020, there was a lot of people that were saying, holy cow, we got this, epidemic. The world economy is shutting down. I can't leave my house. Maybe I'm allowed to work, maybe I'm not, right? And a lot of people were very emotional, and they said, I want to pull my money out of the market. I want to sell and come out of the market. And a lot of our job was talking to people on the phone and saying, hey, listen, I get where you're coming from. I can't leave my house either, but this is what we're seeing.
Well,
and
it's terrifying.
Right.
But how does a program hold your hand, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, like that's my question, right? So you have this computer, and maybe the computer itself says, hey, we don't think we should sell, or we think it's over and we should get back in. Whatever the case may be, it's going to give you its advice. But managing the whole other side and helping people through, their personal situations,
Yeah.
that changes the whole dynamic, because the reality of what a successful portfolio isn't just risk versus return or some analytical data. It's how is a portfolio successful for that individual.
Right.
Right. And sometimes those investment portfolios look completely different for two people at the same age that might think they're in the same risk tolerance, but they might have different life dynamics or things that change, right? Like all of a sudden, this happened actually last week, or a really good friend of mine lost his wife, 45 years old, completely unexpected, right? How does a robot handle that? Do you call up the robot and say,
It asks for a death certificate?
like, hey, all of a sudden I'm risk averse because I feel like my world's falling apart because I just lost my spouse, or hey, all of a sudden, just so many different dynamics as far as what you're able to handle as a person can change.
Yeah.
And a robot just can't hold, like you said, hold your hand through that or help you understand some of those things. Or maybe it even say, hey, everything's going to be okay if you're financially sound. Let's stay on the path.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So I think that's a huge aspect that I don't know if it can ever really be replaced, is the human element. If you have a financial advisor that really knows you and your personality, your preferences, your values, right? All those things are so important, rather than just looking at one aspect of, risk return, and this is the efficient frontier and all those types of things.
And I think it's important to remember that AI doesn't have to replace the whole solution.
Right.
Like you mentioned, there are strategies that we employ that have machine learning, that use that type of technology, which it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere.
Right.
So get on the boat or watch it leave. However, I don't think that human connection, when you're talking about dealing with something that you've worked your whole life to set up, we work our whole lives to put away and save for retirement and make sure that we're good to go and potentially have something to give to our family when we go. Handing that off to someone that you can't look in the eyes and form a connection with and build a bond with, that's scary. I mean, it's not unheard of. People are going to do it, but it's scary.
Yeah. Yeah. I think especially when you look at creating a legacy, because, those types of people, when they're saying, like you said, I've worked my life, I've built up this, whatever my net worth is, and I want it to go to my kids, but I want them to understand, X, Y, Z. And we've talked about like having the family constitution and like why that's so important. And attorneys a lot of times will do the best they can to draft a trust to try to facilitate that. But there is that element, when I meet with a family and we're meeting with the next generation and I say, hey, I knew your grandfather for the past 15 years. I've worked with him, and, I can talk about the experiences, what was important to him, why we invested the way that we invested. And and I can kind of help bring that along. Also, things get more complex than that, right? I mean, talking about, hey, I've built up this net worth and I want to send it on to my kids. Well, can a robot replace an advisor that has a team that he works with that has an attorney and a CPA and maybe other specialists to sit down and say, okay, we have this amount of wealth and it's going to go to the next generation. How do we minimize taxes? As
To be candid, the other day I was playing with ChatGPT, and I know there are other better softwares for this that could probably do a better idea, but something as simple as creating a balance sheet. So I gave it some fake data, assets, liabilities, everything like that. And I tried for an hour and a half tweaking with it to get a correct balance sheet from ChatGPT, and it couldn't do it.
really,
Couldn't do it.
and that's one of the most, you'd say, more commonly known or more advanced
Sure. Yeah.
things, right?
As far as a chat log AI, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Because I think it's not just in advisor space; it's everywhere else, right? Like, so there are platforms that do it for attorneys. It might be like LegalZoom, right? So I want a trust, or I want some sort of legal document, an LLC that's created, and you're going to give it input, and it's going to spit you out this thing, and it's going to be a lot cheaper than going to see an attorney.
Yeah.
So I did an experiment about a year ago. I have a couple companies that I've had created professionally, right? And then I decided to try LegalZoom. It was a lot cheaper, and I had it create a company for me because I wanted to go through the experience. And I was like, okay, let's see what this is all about. And what was amazing to me is I paid the $350, whatever it was, and it spit out LLC documents, right? And then it gave me a pre-formatted instructions. Okay, Rich, now that you've created this LLC, here's what you need to do. But that LLC document was so bare bones. You know what I mean? I looked at it and said, is this an LLC? Yeah. Does it fit? Does it have what it needs to be, filed with the state? Yeah. But does it actually cover what I'm trying to do? Does it have bylaws that fit my personal situation, especially if something happens to me?
Company structure and
Yeah, because in my personal situation, I have other LLCs and a trust, right? And so how does it interact? Does it do all that? No. And so on the one hand, I kind of look at it and say, it's that age-old saying my grandpa said, right? You get what you pay for.
exactly.
And to an extent, I think at least in that realm, I think that's true because it was an LLC. It did go to the state of Utah. It got filed, but it does not do a lot of the things that I needed it to do, and I'll have to amend it as time goes on. Another one that does it, I think, right now is TurboTax.
Yeah.
Or now there's other softwares that compete with TurboTax. And we actually had a conversation with the CPA about this the other day. And I think that if you have something very simple, right, you get a W-2, you have a mortgage, maybe a couple real simple things. Yeah, like that's simple enough that the computer can probably figure it out.
Yeah.
But if you have 3 different companies and you have multiple different investment accounts, investment properties, all these different types of things, what he noticed was with TurboTax is, and other softwares like it, I don't want to just pick on them,
Sure.
but it was so conservative because, last thing in the world, TurboTax wants is for the IRS to come in and say, hey, this robot's giving bad tax
they
advice,
tout
right?
something like 100% accuracy guaranteed.
Right.
So they do that by pulling the lever way back and not utilizing a lot of the provisions that could be available to business owners.
Exactly, right? So is it allowed to even be to look at things and say, hey, like maybe this expense actually fits better over here, and this company should be using this for its expenses and those types of things. And so again, like, is it cheaper? Yes. Is it accurate? Is it probably going to pass the IRS sniff test? I think so. But how much is it costing you in tax to not have a live person looking at it saying, you know what?
Getting to understand your whole situation, not just the numbers. And I think that's kind of what we've been circling, is that an algorithm helps with numbers, and there's a place for it all over the place. But is it going to help with the whole situation and understand your situation, understand who you are and what your real needs are? I don't think yet. Maybe in the future, but probably not yet.
And again, I think it would be, I'm personally scared of it, right? Because again, there's a certain element where I just don't trust machines.
Yeah.
I don't like self-driving cars. I trust myself more, even though there's some pretty amazing technology out there.
Sure.
And I think there's some other aspects that are just so important when it comes to advisory, right? So I mean, a little bit of a story that we experienced over the last year was we had a client had investment accounts, and all of a sudden we get a fax, and the fax was a power of attorney on behalf of the client. She had appointed somebody to be her power of attorney, and immediately, like, little red lights are going off in my head saying, this doesn't feel right. But was it a legit power of attorney? It was, right? She had signed this power of attorney and given power of attorney to this person. But then 2 weeks later, this person calls me, right, and says, hey, liquidate all the accounts and send them to me in this checking account. And red lights are going off. I'm like, okay, I got to call the client. We couldn't get a hold of the client. And so, but we still didn't feel right about it. So we talked with the back office and we spoke with attorneys, and lo and behold, this individual is up to no good. We were able to stop that from happening. And I wonder, in that situation, what would a robo-advisor have done? If there's no personal relationship, why did it seem weird to me? I know her. Like, and
Right.
I've known her for a long time. I've known her brother for a very long time.
You understand her goals and objectives and what the intent for the money was, and
that wasn't it.
and.
Yeah, you know, right? And so all of a sudden, when I know all these different elements, I'm saying, hey, like, this doesn't feel right. And the way that we got a hold of her, actually, and luckily we had a provision inside that allowed us to, is she had written down, if in an emergency you can contact this person, who happened to be another person I know. So I called that person. I said, hey, I can't get a hold of her. And he went over and got a hold of her and had her call me. Sure enough, that's the way it worked. The personal relationships in those types of environments, I don't think you can really replace a person, at least not that I'm really aware of, right? Because it was legit. It was a legit power of attorney. It was signed. It was notarized, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's just the person who had it was abusing it and using it in the wrong way. And so I think in that aspect too, like, okay, what is a robo-advisor going to do? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know, with the big firms that are using these robo-advisors, I don't know if they have a human element that would look at that particular aspect.
And that's my guess, is that there's human oversight for every AI implementation. You'd hope.
You'd hope,
Right?
But going back to the bank, with it inadvertently, had this underwriting process that maybe went away they didn't intend it to be.
Yeah.
Eventually they caught
Yeah.
it. Eventually, right? But after how many people maybe had received a decline on a mortgage application that they maybe shouldn't have, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think that, like you said, there's a place for it. It is extremely helpful to any person that, hey, we want to research some investments, and I have a tool that can go out and gather information for me and bring it back. Like, that's really helpful and saves a lot of time. But making some of those decisions, right? Another example, I think that is interesting. So a lot of times when we look at investments, we might do due diligence, right? We're going to look into this thing. And I was looking at a particular investment, and this was probably 12, 13 years ago, maybe longer. But I flew out to California to meet with this company, and I knew that they were going to give me their pitch, right? They're going to sit me down. They're going to tell me the greatest thing ever and why they're so wonderful, right? And I was at the hotel. I went down to have breakfast, and I sat at this table by myself, and I was just reading the news. And lo and behold, here comes these three guys, all dressed in suits, super nice, right? Dressed to the nines. And they sat down at my table, and they started having this conversation that, to be honest with you, was appalling. The things they were talking about, the language that they were using, it made me feel uncomfortable. And I'm not really a person that gets embarrassed very much, right? But I was super uncomfortable with these guys. Enough that I finished early, I cleaned up my stuff, and I left.
Yes.
Later, about 45 minutes later, they called for the first meeting. All the investment advisors went in the room, and the guy that I had breakfast with was the presenter and the CEO of the company. And I stepped out, and I called a friend of mine, and I said, we're not investing with this company. And I'm here to tell you, like, this guy is just, I get a bad vibe from him, right? And lo and behold, we didn't invest with that company. A couple of years later, it had gone bankrupt because that gentleman was up to no good, right? And so sometimes, again, if you looked at just the pure financials of that company and what was being put out by their accountants and stuff,
It looked good.
it looked good. And there was a lot of advisors that went ahead and invested with that particular company. I'm not saying that the human element is perfect, right?
Yeah.
But what I am saying is that was a very important moment for me to say, hey, like when I'm looking out for my clients and I'm looking for places to invest with, you got to trust your gut sometimes. And
Yeah,
sometimes you get that feel, right?
There's an interpersonal element that I don't know that it can ever be replaced.
Yeah.
I don't know that it ever should be replaced.
I don't think they should ever run solo. And there's been so many instances where I think for better or worse, right? Where we've all had good experiences with technology.
Yeah.
But we've also had some really bad experiences. So speak of ChatGPT, this is kind of a funny story off to the side, but my kids were teaching me about, because they were talking about it, right? They're like, hey, there's this thing called ChatGPT, and I didn't know what it was. And so I said, I want to learn how to use it. And they're like, okay, Dad, like go to ChatGPT. And then I think I typed in something or I spoke something into it. So I was on my phone. And I said, write a love poem to my wife. And it did. It did. It wrote this crazy love poem to my wife. I copied and pasted it and I texted it to my wife. And immediately my wife calls me and says, this isn't you. Like,
Who wrote that?
Who wrote that?
Yeah.
What's going on, right? And so I don't know if college professors can kind of do the same thing when you ask ChatGPT to write a paper for you. But again, what was that information missing? It was missing the human element, my human element, right?
Yeah,
like,
personality.
right. Like,
And I'm sure with enough data, it could emulate personality, but how much are you willing to give a robo-advisor? How much are you,
Yeah.
how much work is that going to take as opposed to having a conversation or a relationship with your regular advisor?
right. And I think that goes to another point. And I think it's okay to just be blunt about this, but if a large firm or a wirehouse is offering you a robo-advisor, what are they actually saying to you, right? A lot of the larger wirehouses and firms, they have minimums. Most financial advisors do. They have a minimum that just says, hey, first, it doesn't really make sense for you to work with us until you reach a certain level of assets. And that's not to be rude or condescending. It's just to say, with what it costs, this is probably where it makes sense,
It's
right?
in every industry, there's a certain minimum, and
Right.
that's just how it works.
And so I think a lot of times, when I get offers, because I have investment accounts, obviously, and I have them at some of the big wirehouses that I self-manage. But it's interesting, I get the emails, and it says, hey, you should use our robo-advisor. But what they're trying to tell me, in my opinion, is hey, looking at this one account that you have here, you're not big enough for us to spend the time of an actual human advisor.
To pay the salary of an advisor to advise you,
Right.
we've got an algorithm that'll do it for
Yeah.
pennies on the dollar.
So here's this thing, we'll give it to you for free, and for you, that's good enough. And part of me goes back and forth, right? Because going back to the tax return example, there are people out there that have a simple enough tax return, it might make sense. Like, hey, save a couple $100 and enter the information yourself, and it's
Yeah.
going to be accurate, right? Maybe there are investment portfolios like that, but I think when I'm looking at it, I say, okay, what are they giving me? What are they telling me? Again, like, and if I die, something happens to me, is the robot going to help my wife understand,
What the investments are, where they need to go. Is there a person that oversees that? Is there? I'm sure it's in disclosure somewhere, but
yeah, there's just that human element. But on the flip side, if the reality is if something were to happen to me, my attorney knows me very well. My CPA knows me really well. My insurance person knows me really well. And I think if she called any one of those people and said something happened to Rich, they'd be like, oh my gosh. And they would know where everything is. She should know where everything is as well, but they would know where everything is. They'd know exactly what to do, what our options were, all that kind of stuff. And really, those are the big decisions.
yeah,
I think that those life-changing decisions when a big event happens, and it's not just, again, like how much stock, how much bonds, what's my asset allocation, what's my risk return, all that kind of stuff. These are the decisions where it's like, hey, should I pay the tax now? Should I pay the tax later? Is there a different way for these assets to transfer from one generation to another to avoid tax? If so, how do we do it?
what are the situations that each of my beneficiaries have? How do I help them? How do I make sure that they have the proper, channels to receive inheritance? Things like that. That
Yeah.
if you've got a robo advisor that's just measuring beta and standard deviation,
I think that's its limitation. And again, so I think going back, it's like, okay, technology is great, but we need to mark, in my opinion, and understand clearly what its limitations are. So, can a robo-advisor replace an individual that does holistic planning? I honestly can't see how you could do it. Like, it would have
at
to
least
be,
not yet.
not yet, right? It would have to be such a crazy software to do that. Like honestly, we could try it, right? Like somebody could say, okay, I'm going to take TurboTax, LegalZoom, and a robo-advisor, and I'm going to see how they interact.
Yeah.
And the biggest problem is, number one, they can't interact, right? Because they don't have the interfaces to do that. But number two, how that all works together, the way an advisor would look at it, I think, well, we're just not there, right? So I don't know. I know the assets are on the rise. I think that they're, we can see the trend lines. They're going up. More and more people are using them. And I hope, and I think that it's probably for the people that, again, it's fairly simplistic, right? I'm just starting out in investing. It doesn't warrant paying a retainer.
Well, and it's super convenient because they send you the email. Here's the link. Click it. We'll do it for you.
Right.
Convenient doesn't always equal competitive.
Yeah, and then there's that human aspect to it too, right? I mean, we had another example the other day, and I was kind of amazed by it. But we were working with a large wirehouse with an individual. He had some pretty sizable accounts, and he had a human financial advisor, right? Who I think had done a fairly decent job at giving him financial advice. This particular person had 3 financial advisors, and so he got good advice from all 3. But the amazing thing that happened was when he passed away, he had a lot of beneficiaries. It wasn't just to his kids; it was to his grandkids. And he wanted to leave a legacy, and I had talked a lot with him about what this legacy was.
Sure.
Right, that he wanted to pass on. And what was amazing is the big wirehouse account, when they saw that it was going to, in this case, 11 different beneficiaries, and they said, okay, we're going to take this one account, break it up 11 ways. It became 11 individual accounts that were no longer big enough to warrant a financial advisor, even though there was a financial advisor originally that knew this guy's wishes and how he wanted it to go. But the wirehouse made a decision, and it said these 11 people individually are no longer big enough for a financial advisor. And literally they said, go fill out paperwork on the website, open your own accounts, you're on your own. And that is not what he wanted.
It's different. That's not the client's wishes, but it's a big wirehouse's cutoff.
Right. And they're welcome to that, right? Like everybody has their cutoff points about where they think that line is that it makes business sense.
Absolutely.
But I can tell you from the beneficiary standpoint, they looked at it and they said, there's a lot of decisions to be made here. There was IRAs, and there's certain ways that you have to take those distributions and a certain timeline. That advice wasn't provided.
Yeah, but no one to explain all of that. It's complicated stuff.
Yeah.
It forces maybe an unsophisticated individual into a sophisticated scenario, and quickly.
Right. And some of those beneficiaries were fairly young.
Yeah.
Right. And so throwing that at someone that is barely out of high school or in college, and they're like, I have no idea what's going on. As all I know is I was told to fill out this, form online, and all of a sudden I'm in the self-directed account, assets show up. There's a robot there to tell me how to invest it. But who's telling me
what to tell the robot?
Right. Are you even giving it good input? Do you even understand what the robot's asking you? And so those types of things I think can be a little bit scary. But they do have a place, right?
Yeah.
There are some people that love to do it on their own, and they like to do their own taxes, and they like to.
And they can do a good job.
Yeah.
But I don't know that there's a replacement for professionals.
No. In fact, there was another thing that I saw, and this blew my mind. Actually, we'll put a picture up here. But I was in Phoenix at a fencing competition, and I was walking down. We were downtown an area, so where all the big businesses are. I was walking down the street, and I won't say the name, but it was a very large financial institution. And on the ground floor where the sidewalk was, there were these glass doors. And you look inside the glass doors, and there was 3 ATM-looking things. So there was a screen and a keyboard, and it kind of looked like an ATM. And so to get in, you had to have a card, and like your debit card or credit card, right, to prove you were a patron of the institution. You swipe it, you go in, and this place was a financial advisory location where you could go. The door closes behind you, so you have some amount of privacy, but you log in and you get somebody in the call center. It may not be the same person you've been talking to before that knows you, right? But what it is you walk in and you can have a conversation. It's like the screen's there, you can see each other, so it's somewhat more personal. But you're literally standing in this empty room with glass walls, and you're trying to make important financial decisions. And again, I get it. Like the younger generations, I think kind of like that sometimes. Like, is it just, it's convenient, right? I guess when you're walking down the street and you want to talk to somebody about something, you could pop in there, swipe your card. But again, I'm just wondering, like, what is that relationship like between the call center, like,
Yeah.
who's in that call center? Is he going to make the same recommendations as if you happen to
and
get somebody else?
even if they leave notes, and detailed, then the next person has to interpret those notes and figure out what they mean and give advice based on those notes. And we've all had emails that we read wrong,
Right.
So
Yeah. So how does that kind of work out? And again, I think what's happening is from a business standpoint, a lot of firms make sense. They're saying, how can we handle more accounts with less human interaction because humans are expensive?
yeah,
And so they're turning to, things like this. But sometimes when we outsource humans, we lose quality, connection, and that human element that I think is just so. I think it's a huge part of what we do. I mean, just knowing our clients, knowing what's important, knowing their family, right? So that when something does happen or if somebody becomes incapacitated, like it's no longer this, oh my gosh, who can we talk to? We already know who to talk to. And in fact, most of the time we already have them on file,
absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
So we can help that family move through that transition, help them make decisions.
I think it's something definitely to keep an eye on moving forward, and maybe even implement some of the tools available, because I think a lot of it can be super beneficial, but not without human intervention and oversight.
Yeah. And again, keeping it within the realm of where it probably deserves to be. If I was in a self-driving car, I've driven some of them that have that feature. And yeah, it's kind of fun to play with it. But would I ever just go to sleep and let it take me somewhere? No.
Not yet.
No, not yet, right? I'm going to be watching that thing
Yeah.
and making sure that for some reason it just doesn't get confused or go off the rails or something like that. I think the same as, like, to your point with finances, right? Like, you can have that, maybe use it as a second set of eyes for something that you're doing. But am I going to take my life savings and turn it over to a program that I don't understand? I personally wouldn't.
Yeah, I wouldn't
Right?
either.
I think there's a lot more to it.